professor of Old Testament. Literally, our teacher today has a PhD in Old Testament studies, so buckle up, everybody, and give it up for Christina Bohn.
I have a whiteboard too, so we're ready to go. Well, I don't know if you guys have realized, but there's something going on called the World Cup. Anybody? Yeah? As an avid soccer fan, I can tell you that this summer I have been living my best life. I don't know, if you have not been watching, I don't know what you've been doing with your life. I will say, you've probably been being a lot more productive than I have been. As a professor, I get to the summer and have all these ideas of what I'm gonna do. And to be completely honest, I haven't got any of those things done because I've been watching all these soccer matches. There have been a lot of really exciting things that have been happening, so let me catch you up if you've not been paying attention. Here's some of the big highlights that I would highlight as I'm thinking about 2026 World Cup. First, there was this small little nation called Cabo Verde. This African nation that completely stole our hearts, took us by storm. This is the goalie of Cabo Verde, who is 40 years old. And for somebody who's in her late 30s, it's really made me laugh with these commentators who's like, he's 40, he's like halfway in his grave, right? So he's 40, and a beautiful moment is after his first match, he's in tears, just in complete disbelief that he made it, that he's there with his team. Another big moment is Curacao, another small nation. Fun fact, this nation, you can fit the entire population within 2 of our stadiums. That is how small they are. We're able to make it, and we're able to even withstand a couple really big teams, which is a really big moment for them. Paraguay, this is one of my favorite matches. Paraguay beating Germany in a shootout. That was an incredible game. I was on the edge of my seat. So their goalie was absolutely a phenomenon. And then another one, I hate to say, but England just barely beating Mexico. It was such a close match. I thought that was one of the most exciting matches that I've seen in this tournament, just how fast-paced it was. But behind the scenes, so you have those big moments, but behind the scenes, there have been a lot more smaller moments. Things that have given me pause and have made me reflect a little bit more about how do we define meaning. And it's not just Europeans discovering Costco for the first time, or Texas Roadhouse, which are really great, but some other small, subtle things that have been happening. I wonder if you've been paying attention. One, for example, is Japanese fans cleaning trash. Every time they've been in a stadium, they have a whole army that just goes around and starts collecting trash. They brought gloves and plastic bags. They're ready to go. This is a practice in their culture that they do at every stadium to show honor and respect to their host. Just down the street in Lawrence, we've had Algerian fans being welcomed as part of their community. Last I heard, Lawrence is actually trying to become kind of like a sister city to a town in Algeria because they've had such a meaningful connection, a very beautiful friendship between the two. One of my favorites footage has been following the Scottish fans in Boston. They have completely obliterated all of their beer supply. I don't know if you heard that, but they were in a crisis because they did not have enough beer to go around. But there's something beautiful about the way that Boston adopted them as their own. And I don't know if you did hear this, but just last week it was actually confirmed by the mayor of Boston that they are now a sister city of Glasgow, which I think is really cool as part of that friendship that they've had. But then for me personally, I've had a lot of meaningful interactions as well. I'm talking to the cashier at Aldi. I was on a flight a couple weeks ago, heading back to Kansas City, and I met an Ecuador fan. He was coming here to watch his team, some Algerian fans, and it was great to see their excitement. But then even in my neighborhood, there's a man who in his front yard, you can see here on this next picture, he has all these flags that he put up in his front yard. And when I met him, he's from Guatemala and was just so excited with his son to kind of celebrate all these world cultures and wanted them to be represented in their front yard. And even that was a meaningful connection as I got to get to know my neighbor just a little bit better. And it's made me consider, about years from now, how would I talk about this World Cup? I wasn't quite old enough for the World Cup that we had in the US last time in the 90s, but I remember my dad talking about it, and he had these moments he would talk about, these things that happened. And I wonder, how will I define this World Cup for future generations? What kind of themes? And yes, there will be big moments. I'm thinking about, for example, Croatia losing to Poland. Oh, that was crushing. I will think about those things. I will probably remember that France is probably gonna be the one that wins, but I do think that years from now, when I think about the World Cup, I'm going to think about those smaller, meaningful moments, the moments of connection, the moments of humanity, these moments of common ground and friendship that we've cultivated. And so it's made me think about, how do we define meaning and how do we define themes, these common threads that we have within these common experiences? For the past few weeks this summer, we've been working through the second history of Israel. The Deuteromistic history is what it's called. We started with the book of Judges, and we talked about these themes of barrenness and chaos over and against the life-giving presence of God, and how those themes were kind of put in contrast to the ways that God's people showed good leadership and vulnerability, like the character of Deborah. Just last week, Tim introduced Hannah. And as he's talking about Hannah, notice her themes of vulnerability and faithfulness. Hannah really was a strong contrast with what we see happening with the book of Judges, where instead of giving in to this power struggle, we see that Hannah is willing to confess her frailty without God, her need for God, and as a result is able to model for God's people a new way forward. Instead of succumbing to that theme of barrenness, we see her move forward in the life-giving presence of God. And something else that Tim noted, that at the beginning of 1 Samuel, is Hannah had a song that she sung. Now, this is a really important theme that we're going to see moving forward, because in Hannah's song is going to set the stage for some of those really big, I would say big, but also very subtle themes that we see throughout the books of 1 and 2 Samuel. Hannah's song had themes of power reversals, of the rich becoming poor, of the powerful becoming weak, of the humbled becoming righteous and upraised in their society. These are the themes that we're going to see throughout 1 and 2 Samuel, but they're subtle, and we have to look for them. And in fact, Hannah's song is going to be booked end with something at the end of 2 Samuel. David also sings a song in 2 Samuel chapter 22. And his song sounds incredibly similar to Hannah's song. It's going to have the same themes about those power reversals, about the weak becoming proud. These are the themes, like I said, this is called an inclusio. If you're going to be really geeky, this is called inclusio, but think of it kind of like these bookends or these brackets that are framing the entire two books. Now, these two books are designed actually to be read in tandem or in conjunction with each other. In fact, if you were to look at a really old Hebrew scroll, you would realize that they're actually in one big scroll. In our English Bibles, we decided that was way too long, so we've separated them into 1 and 2 Samuel. But in the Hebrew tradition, it is just Samuel telling one big story. And the reason why I want to point this out is because we're going to see these themes that are going to help us understand the passage that we're going to look at today. So if you will indulge me just a little bit, I'm going to frame these two books just to give us an idea of what the authors are trying to thematically communicate to us, some things that we need to look for. And then we're going to focus in on one big passage that I think is going to really encapsulate these different themes. So the way that 1 and 2 Samuel is structured is around two different kings. Hey, Hannah has a son named Samuel, and Samuel is the one who anoints these two kings. And these two kings are going to be put in contrast with each other, very intentionally. Now, the way that they tell these stories of these two different kings is thematically. Okay, these editors are more interested in talking about these themes. Sometimes it's going to be chronological, but they're really more interested in good storytelling. For those of you storytellers, you know this is what you do. And so the way that they structure these books is first by talking about Saul's kingship, and then by talking about David's kingship. And they're concerned about how these different rulers have risen to power and then how they fall out of power. And so if I were to illustrate what these two books look like, they look something like this. First, we're going to have Saul's rise to power and fall from power. In the middle of it, we're introduced to the second king of Israel, David. He's going to have a rise to power. We're going to see the pinnacle here. We're going to take a look at that passage a little bit later. And then we're also going to see his fall, which is what Tim's going to pick up and talk about next time. Now, to give you an example, okay, we first start off with Saul. Saul is the king that Israel wants.
And in fact, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, when God's people are complaining, they say, we need to be like the other nations. What they mean is, we don't want to go back to the time of the judges. We don't want to go back to the time of anarchy, where these leaders are kind of like inconsistent. We don't know when a leader is going to rise. We want a military leader who's going to be able to subdue our enemies around us. We don't want to be occupied by the Moabites and the Amalekites anymore. And so what's really funny is this is the language that God tells Samuel. He says, listen to their voice and give them the king that they want. Okay, what he is really meant, some of you are parents, you're like, I think I understand what he's doing there, right? A little bit passive aggressive, it's like, okay, give them exactly what they want. And Saul is the kind of king that the Israelites want. He is a military leader. He's very good at fighting the Philistines. And then the way that the authors talk about his pinnacle of power is in chapter 14, where it gives a summary of Saul's life, and it says he subdued the Philistines, and it says all of Saul's day there was bitter war, and Saul never hesitated to conscript people into the military. This is the best thing about Saul, according to how the authors structure his story, is in chapter 14, Saul is the one, he was a warrior, who vanquishes their enemies, and once again brings them out of that era of judges that they're so concerned about. Now, right after the best thing about Saul, the authors tell us the things that lead to his downfall. Once again, this is very good storytelling. And so after they tell us that he is a warrior, then when we get to chapter 15, we see as Saul is being a warrior, he decides that he wants a war trophy. He is not supposed to take the king hostage, but he does as a way of showing just how strong of a military prowess that he has. After this case, what happens is Saul denies him as king. He says, God has rejected you as king. He's going to anoint somebody else to be king because you have acted in disobedience toward him. And then when we get to chapter 16, that's when we're introduced to David. Do you see that chronology there? Chapter 14, the best thing that he did. Chapter 15, the thing that leads to his downfall. Chapter 16, moving on to the next story, okay? Now with David, just like with Saul, the authors are going to be interested in telling us the best thing about his reign, and then they're also going to be interested in talking about the things that lead to his downfall. Now, for those of us who might be a little bit familiar with David's story, we might be thinking about maybe some very big stories that happen in his life, right? David, as he's anointed king after Saul, he's a shepherd, the youngest of his family, somebody who is overlooked. He's anointed king. And then one of the big stories that happens in 1 Samuel is that he goes head to head against a Philistine by the name of Goliath. Here we have a contest between these gods. Who is the best god? Dagon is the Philistine god, represented by Goliath, versus Yahweh, the Israelite God, represented by David. It's a classic story for a reason. The underdog is the one who gets the upper hand, right? But here's what I want you to notice. This is not the best thing about David. This is early in his story. It's an important story, don't get me wrong. It tells us a lot about David and his character, but this is not the height of his reign. Oftentimes, though, this one overshadows the rest of his story. After David defeats Goliath, later here in 2 Samuel, he is finally anointed king. He unites the north and the south. Looks like he is able to kind of bring stability into this nation, this kingdom that is still kind of disgruntled over Saul and David and these two different kings. He unites them together by creating Jerusalem as the new capital, bringing the Ark of the Covenant. Still not the best thing about David. Then, in 2 Samuel chapter 7, a very important passage, where God makes a covenant with David. David says, God, I want to build you a house. I want to build you a temple. And God says, I'll do you one better. I will build you a house. It's a play on words there. David wants to build a house. God says, I'll build you a house. What God promises David is that he would have a dynasty, that his child would become the next king of Israel, his grandson, and so on and so forth, that he would have a lineage that would be forever. Now, for those of us followers of Christ, we understand that this is fulfilled in Jesus from the line of David, who is part of this kingship. But for David in this context, this would have been, for him, in this ancient Eastern world, this would have been the best thing that a king could hope for. Stability, your name's gonna be remembered forever. You have a lineage in this patriarchal culture. This would have been huge. But once again, this is not the best thing about David. David, he fights the Philistines. He does the same thing that Saul did here in 2 Samuel chapter 7, is able to bring more stability, but still not the best thing that David did. And for us as readers, we've seen that pattern with Saul. We're wondering, okay, like, where are we going with this? We've had some very big moments here. We saw David defeat Goliath. We saw him become king. We saw him unite them. We saw this covenant. What could possibly be better than these big themes in David's life? And then finally, we get to 2 Samuel chapter 9, and we get this story. Let me read this for us again. We're expecting a very big moment, but this is what David does next. David asked, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and he was summoned to David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "At your service." The king said, "Is there anyone remaining of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God?" And Ziba said to the king, "There remains a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." And the king said to him, "Where is he?" Ziba said to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, at Lo-debar." Now, if we were an ancient Near Eastern audience, okay, the original listeners hearing the story for the first time, we might be a little bit suspicious about this story. David has just brought peace. He's vanquished the Philistines. What is going to stop him from eliminating any other competition he might have to his throne? Now, in this culture, this was a common practice that when you became king, you would perceive any threat to your power and you would eliminate them as quickly as possible as a way of trying to stay in power. People who are in power want to stay in power, right? They will do everything at that cost. We would expect David to do this. And so this question of, is there any of my enemies left, would give us pause. We'd be wondering what exactly his intentions are. Now, to help put this in context, in the 600s, which would have been a little bit after the time of David, there was an Assyrian king by the name of Ashurnapal, not a name that I get to use very often, Ashurnapal. And what he did is, as soon as he came into power, he hunted down all of his father's enemies. He mutilated and tortured them, executed them, cut them up into pieces, and then fed them to dogs, sending a message about who exactly is in power and the lengths that he's going to do to stay in power. He was one of the Assyrian kings who actually had the longest reign, and that's for a reason, because he was ruthless and willing to do anything to stay in power. In our biblical tradition, David's son Solomon actually does a very similar thing, where as soon as Solomon came to power in 1 Kings, he made sure that he hunted down all his enemies, one of whom was his own brother, and murdered them as a way of trying to solidify that power. Now, after that Davidic covenant, okay, where God says you're always going to have a son on the throne, we might be wondering if this is what David will do in order to fulfill that covenant. Is he willing to trust that that is going to be God's work, or is he willing to put his own violence into effect in order to ensure that this will happen? In other words, David's question, like I said, raises those doubts, but it sounds a little bit like in the New Testament. When a baby is born, there's a king by the name of Herod, and he says, "Where is this king that I may worship him?" Right? A little bit concerned about what David is about to do. And so what happens next would have greatly surprised us as ancient readers. Here's what David does next, starting in verse 5. Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, at Lo-debar. Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and did obeisance. And David said, "Mephibosheth." He answered, "I am your servant." David said to him, "Do not be afraid, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you yourself shall eat at my table always." He did obeisance and said, "What is your servant that you should look upon a dead dog such as I?" Then the king summoned Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. You and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce, so that your master's grandson may have food to eat. But your master's grandson Mephibosheth shall always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so your servant shall do." Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he always ate at the king's table. Now he was lame in both feet. Friends, this is the best thing about David, is that David is willing to show mercy and kindness, not just any kindness, but extravagant kindness to his enemies. I want you to notice the contrast here. David being the warrior that all of God's people wanted versus David who's willing to show mercy to this vulnerable enemy. This enemy that he could have quickly eliminated. We see the vulnerability in that this young man, Mephibosheth, has a disability. He's crippled in both of his feet. This is no contest, somebody very easily to eliminate. And yet, David, who holds all this power, and wants, I am sure, to stay in that power, is willing to express humility to this person. Now, if we'd been paying attention throughout 2 Samuel, we actually would have seen this theme happen already quite a few times. Like with the World Cup, you have those big moments, but then you also have those more common threads, those subtler moments. Same thing is happening here in 2 Samuel, is this is not the first time that David has actually showed kindness to his enemies. When David, for example, was first anointed as king, Saul was still in power, and David did nothing to try and usurp Saul's power. He could have. He had a bunch of people, his own little militia army. He could have usurped Saul's power, but he chose not to. Many times Saul tried to kill David, and David had many times where he could have returned the favor, but David said, "No, that's not my place. It's not my role to overthrow the person that God has appointed into this position." At the beginning of 2 Samuel, which is Saul's downfall, Saul dies at the end of a battle. And instead of gloating, like maybe I would, or at least being relieved, the way that David begins 2 Samuel is actually mourning over the death of Saul. He's absolutely grieved that his enemy died in such a humiliating way. And then when, at the beginning of 2 Samuel, when the northern tribes decide they want Saul's son Ishbosheth to become the next king, he dies, David becomes king. David actually expresses grief over Saul's son Ishbosheth also dying, even though Ishbosheth was his competition for the throne. This is something that David has expressed over and over again. This is the kind of king that the Israelites should have. This is the king after God's own heart, not a king in reaction to the time of the judges. And here's what I want you to notice in this passage. That while we're a little bit unsure about David's intentions, the first thing that David does when he sees this young, vulnerable man is he calls him by name, Mephibosheth. If you look closely at this passage, not even Ziba did. Ziba was talking about, he's like, well, there's a son of Saul, doesn't mention his by name. David is the first person to give him a name in this passage as a way of showing his humanity. And I want you to notice the contrast of power. Here we have David, who has all the power in the situation, versus Mephibosheth, who's from a failed revolutionary, right? Who literally has a disability. He's vulnerable, has nothing he can give David. And then notice that he lies down prostrate before David, okay? Think about a person who has this type of a physical disability lying down on the ground, showing this utter humility. How painful that would have been for Mephibosheth. You have this stark contrast between the man who has all the power and this vulnerable man who has no power and would have been an easy target. Now, confession time. If you are like me, you get a little bit cynical or wary of people in power, right? That was me when I was reading this. I was like, how do we really know that David didn't have any ulterior intentions to showing this kindness to Mephibosheth. What if there was actually something in it for him? Now, there are some people who have been critics of David and have wondered the same thing. But if we look closely in this passage, it seems, I'm not saying that there aren't any benefits to David doing this, because for a person in power, there's nothing politically neutral in any decision that you make, right? Everything has some sort of repercussion if you make as a leader. But in this passage, there's no indication that David is doing this to serve his own purposes. It seems like David is really doing this out of the goodness of his heart, out of faithfulness to the friendship that he had with Saul's son Jonathan. And even if we are concerned that David is trying to eliminate Mephibosheth because he's a threat, in this culture, if a person has a physical, very alarming or very apparent disability like this, that they would not be eligible to be a king. So once again, this is an easy target for David, and there's nothing that Mephibosheth can give him. Mephibosheth can't even take care of himself. He needs somebody to carry him around in this culture, and David has nothing to gain by giving this. Now, another indication in this text that David is doing this is his word choice of chesed. Okay? Now, in Hebrew, it's a little bit more phlegm than that, a little bit more throat. It's like chesed. All right? Sometimes I can get it, and sometimes I can't. This is the word that David uses twice. Is there hesed that I can show to one of the sons of Saul? In Hebrew, this is a very significant word that appears over and over again throughout the Old Testament, and it's kind of hard to define because of just how significant it is. It is a word that comes out of the character and the identity of God. Exodus 34, for example, says, the Lord, the God of chesed, the loving kindness. Sometimes in English, we translate it love or kindness or mercy, but it's a little bit more deeper than that. It can encompass all of those things and yet more. Typically, when we see chesed, it's the person in power who is doing something for somebody who has no power and cannot repay that person. There is no expectation that the person will repay you for this kindness that you were given. It is just simple, pure, extravagant kindness. 2/3 of the time in the Old Testament, when we see the word chesed, is used in regard to Yahweh, to God. This is one of God's most defining characteristics. And whenever we see chesed, we see other God-like characteristics also present. It's almost like these beautiful virtues gravitate toward chesed. If you have God's loving kindness, you're going to see truth. You're going to see justice. You're going to see humility. You're going to see mercy. It's all one big package deal. Now, for David to say he wants to show the chesed, he doesn't just say chesed, but he says the chesed of God, the highest possible mercy that can be given. Now, if I were David, thank God I'm not, but if I were, I'd be like, what's the least I have to do, right? What's the smallest little mercy I can give? Just as a way of trying to fulfill this promise I made to Jonathan. What David could have done, he just could have spared Mephibosheth's life. That would have been enough. That would have been extravagant in itself. But David goes above and beyond that. He gives land back to Mephibosheth, land that David had acquired, so this is costing him something. But then he also lavishes his love upon Mephibosheth by inviting him to have a place at his table. This is a place of honor and respect. This isn't something that you just give anybody, but it's a way of showing this extravagant kind of mercy and love. And this kind of love is not without cost. Not only does it cost David that land that he's giving back to Mephibosheth, but I want you to look at this story in light of Saul, who was the king that the Israelites wanted. The king who eliminated all of their enemies, the king who was strong and powerful and a warrior. I want you to think about what this story might have done to this type of different people. They want this strong-armed, powerful king, and here you have this king who is showing mercy to their enemy. I imagine that this story would have cost David, even within public reputation or public opinion, about just what kind of a king do we have within this political position. And yet, David is the model for what the Israelites need in a king, and I would argue the model for us today. Now, this wouldn't be an Old Testament sermon without Walter Brueggemann. If you've been here around, you know what I mean. This is what Brueggemann said in his commentary. He said this: "We need artistic portrayal at a distance to see ourselves up close." And as I've wrestled with this passage for this past week, I've wondered, how can I see myself up close in this model that we have from the person of David? Now, let me be vulnerable with you. Whenever I think about people in power, I assume that I'm not that person. I deflect. I change the subject. I assume it is those people. I assume it is the trillionaires, the billionaires. You know who I'm talking about? I assume it's those people in political office, and I think this is a message for them. This is not a message for me. Deflect, out of sight, out of mind, move on. I'm the good person. But what if we see ourselves in the person of David? We are all people who have power of some kind. We might have different levels of power, but we all have power of some kind. Even, for example, even babies have power, right? A baby cries, it gets your attention. It needs you, doesn't it? It's able to have power. Those of you who are young parents, you know, a baby has power over your life, doesn't it? Everybody has power. Me, as a white woman in Johnson County, I have quite a bit of power. Even in my classroom as a professor, I have power. I have power in my community. What would it look like for me not to deflect power from my life, but be willing to look at my power close up and to consider how I am stewarding that power well? And not just well, but in light of Hesed. How am I choosing Hesed with the life that I live? Now, if we were to all write biographies of our life, I imagine there'd be these big moments. Maybe not, we don't fight Goliath or become king, but we'd have these big moments that we would pinpoint. We'd think about graduating high school, maybe finding a career that you really love, finding purpose and meaning, finding a life partner, having children, establishing yourself in a community. All of those are good and beautiful and wonderful things. But what other types of themes would we weave into our narrative? What are those subtle themes that maybe we have to take a little bit of a closer look at? Would we primarily see themes of self-interest, of consumerism, of actions that bring us greater privilege or even greater comfort? Or would we see acts of cruciformity, of extravagant mercy, of the only type of grace that God can give, like in this story? And choosing a life marked by this type of cruciformity always costs us something, just like it cost David something. A little bit of a spoiler alert. Okay? We will get to the downfall next week. But after David's downfall, David's kingdom is kind of like in a dire, precarious position, and Mephibosheth expresses a hope that David is going to have his downfall. Mephibosheth, in the end, is still kind of holding out that maybe his own family will be able to rise back into power. Even for David, just because he showed kindness to his enemy doesn't mean that his enemy is just like suddenly best friends with him. It costs David something. And yet, loving kindness demands that we still are able to devote ourselves to this type of effort. God's love invites us to love without expecting anything in return, or sometimes, in the case of David, even being taken advantage of. Now, this story in David's life reminds us that Hesed is the way forward for God's people. And as I was working through this passage, something that very clearly was pointed out to me a couple times is that in medieval and Renaissance art, artists portrayed Mephibosheth, David's grace to Mephibosheth, alongside Christ giving the Eucharist. And here's an example. This is from the Morgan Picture Bible, which is from 13th century France, where on the left you have David showing kindness to Mephibosheth. And here on the right you have Jesus feeding his disciples. I want you to notice the composition, how similar they are. We place them side by side. We have these kings who hold all the power, and are extravagantly giving grace without asking anything in return. The Christian tradition has seen what David did for Mephibosheth as the image of what Christ does for us. So it only makes sense then for us as God's people to end our time together by partaking in Eucharist. It's a reminder of the loving kindness, this Hesed that God has for us, this extravagant grace. As Christ poured out his life for us, we're reminded of this love that bubbles up in us and it overflows to the people around us, to our entire communities. The Eucharist reminds us that God invites us to the table alongside our enemies, trusting that as we eat and drink together, God's work is done within us, and we become no longer enemies but friends of God together. And as we break bread, we learn how to love each other the way that Christ has loved us. May it be so. Let's pray together. God, in your Hesed, you spared nothing for us, even pouring out the life of your Son on our behalf. And God, as we reflect on this story and the way that David modeled this kindness, not just for anybody, but for his enemies, and as we reflect on the goodness that you have given us, God, I ask that the work of your Spirit would be made apparent within us. God, this call to Hesed, this extravagant kindness, not expecting anything in return, is not something that we are able to do ourselves. I wish it is something that I could do myself. I like being in my own best self-interest. I like being empowered. But God, I know that this is a work that only your Spirit can do. So God, I ask that you would invite your Spirit within us, that you would humble us, that as we view this story, we would see ourselves up close and consider the themes and this higher calling of extravagant love that you have given for us. And God, as we are a world that is seduced by power and seduced by our own self-interest and even seduced by comfort, I ask that you would call us out of that we would be able to see ourselves clearly, that we would be able to see the world around us clearly. And as we, with you, narrate these stories and develop meaning in our lives, that we would catch a glimpse of your Son, Jesus, that your Son would shape us and that we would be made into your image more and more fully. We love you very much, God. Amen.